Hello, everyone. Good afternoon. Welcome to the UCL It's All Academic Festival, and welcome to this event on Brexit, Parliament and the Constitution, hosted by the Constitution Unit here at UCL, and part of our ongoing series of work with the UK in a Changing Europe, an independent expert body based at King's College London, which is the authoritative source for independent research on UK-EU relations. My name's Lisa James. I'm a research assistant at the Constitution Unit, and I'm delighted to be joined by a stellar panel for the event. We have a very broad topic in Brexit, Parliament and the Constitution. The last 3 years has given us plenty to talk about, and I could say the same of the last 3 months or indeed the last 3 weeks. The Brexit process has shone a spotlight on some fundamental issues and questions of our Constitution. Everything from the interaction between representative and direct democracy, to the roles of Parliament, government, the courts, even the monarchy, and the workings of Westminster itself. And of course, the process remains unresolved and looks unlikely to be getting any quieter anytime soon. So it's wonderful to have a superb panel to tackle this huge topic. I'm going to introduce them in the order in which they're going to speak. So firstly, Dr. Alan Renwick, who is Associate Professor of British Politics and Deputy Director of the Constitution Unit, an expert in citizen participation in politics, in all the many forms that can take. Professor Meg Russell, Professor of British and Comparative Politics at UCL, and Director of the Constitution Unit. Meg was recently awarded the 3-year fellowship with the UK in a Changing Europe to investigate just this topic. And Professor Jeff King, who is Professor of Law in the Faculty of Laws at UCL, an expert on constitutional and administrative law, and legal advisor to the House of Lords Select Committee on the Constitution. I've asked each speaker to speak for around 7 to 8 minutes to kick things off, and after that we're going to open up to questions from the floor, so please do be thinking about questions you'd like to ask our panel, and we'll take those in groups of 3 when we come to it. The event is being recorded by us. It will be up on our website later. So if you'd like to ask a question but would rather that your question isn't included in that upload, just let us know when you speak and we'll cut it out. And finally, please do tweet. The hashtag is up on the screen, hashtag It's All Academic. I'm now going to hand over to Alan to begin.
Great, thank you very much, Lisa, and great to see you all here, even on a Saturday. My task is to talk about referendums and, more broadly, how people engage with our democracy. And there are many, many, many things that could be said in relation to referendums and public engagement with democracy. Given limited time, as just defined by Lisa, I will restrict myself to saying 3 things. So the first thing is about the role that referendums play in our democracy. And I think no matter what side you were on in the referendum in 2016, most of us can probably agree that politics since then has been pretty fraught. And many people have drawn the inference that referendums are just a bad idea, that referendums are somehow inherently incompatible with our system of predominantly representative democracy. So, for example, David Alan Green, the prominent constitutional commentator, has argued that referendums, if they're treated as binding, create a clash between 2 rival sources of political legitimacy. He's written that such an approach to referendums does not fit in a system based on representative democracy. He refers to the conceptual incompatibility of popular democracy and a parliamentary system. And the implication of this seems to be that if we want to maintain the health of our parliamentary democracy, and I think we should, and we can talk about that later if you want, we shouldn't hold another referendum. Now that, it seems to me, is an incorrect, or at least an overextended inference from the 2016 referendum. That particular referendum, the Brexit referendum, has placed Parliament in such a difficult situation for 2 reasons. The first is that it was a vote on a general principle, not a precise proposal. So Parliament and government have been left trying to fill in all the detail since that referendum. And the second is that it was a vote on a proposal that most MPs opposed. most MPs did not want Brexit. And so MPs face a tension between the instruction that they feel they have been given by voters in the referendum and what most of them believe is in the country's best interests. And those two factors, the tension that those two factors create, is, I think, a large part of the problem that our politics has faced over the last 3 years. Most referendums, however, are not like that. If you think, for example, of the referendum in 1998 on the Good Friday Agreement in Northern Ireland, the agreement had all been negotiated before the referendum. The details were already there. The politicians had already agreed what was in that agreement. The referendum was simply about conferring popular legitimacy upon the result. And it didn't create the sorts of tension between representative and direct democracy that the Brexit referendum has. And in fact, the UK has had 13 referendums above the local level since our first in 1973. And the Brexit referendum is the only one that has created the kinds of tensions that we have seen over the last 3 years. So referendums don't necessarily create the sort of problem that we've seen. In addition to that, some referendums are necessary. It was necessary to have the Good Friday Agreement referendum in order to confer that public legitimacy on what was otherwise an agreement negotiated among politicians. In order to have Scottish independence, or in order to have Brexit, I think many people would argue you need to have a referendum. You couldn't just have Parliament making those decisions. So it seems to me that the inference that we should draw is that we need to work out how to do referendums better, not that we should not have any further referendums. Which leads on to the second thing that I'd like to talk about, which is how do we do referendums better? And I'd like very quickly to identify 4 principles for referendums. The first 2 follow very directly from what I've just said. So first principle, Parliament should not put a proposal to a referendum if it doesn't support that proposal. A referendum should provide an extra check, an extra sort of source of legitimation for a proposal, for a major decision. It should not be used in order to circumvent the detailed kind of scrutiny that proposals go through in parliamentary democracy when it's working well. Now, I have to confess I do have some qualms about this particular principle because sometimes parliamentary democracy does not work well. And I think there is a case for some kind of process leading to a citizen-initiated process leading to a referendum. But that has to be very carefully designed in order to ensure that you do get quality scrutiny of the proposal. And we could talk later if you want about how you might do that. Second principle is that referendums should only be held on fully worked out proposals, not on general vague principles. Voters should be able to know what it is that they're voting on. The difficulty with this is that sometimes we have to have a referendum on a general principle. So the UK government, for example, is not going to start negotiating for Scottish independence if there hasn't been a referendum vote for Scottish independence. Similarly, the EU would not have started negotiating for Brexit without the referendum first. Irish unification, the unionists are not going to start negotiating the terms of Irish unification unless they're forced to the negotiation table by a referendum first. So sometimes you need to have a referendum on a broad principle. But then the general rule, which is a principle that was enunciated by the Independent Commission on Referendums, which we established a couple of years ago and reported last year, thank you, Meg, is that in such cases there should be 2 referendums. There should be a referendum first on the general principle, and then there should be a referendum on the detail once it has been worked out. And crucially, that 2 referendum process should be established and made very clear before the first referendum. So promising that you're going to deliver the result of a referendum and then holding another one creates big, big problems. Third principle, there should be careful preparation before you call a referendum. All referendums polarize debate. They denude our public discourse of nuance and subtlety. So the more subtleties can be baked in to the process of working out what the proposals should be that are on the ballot paper, and the more an appreciation of the issues at stake can be raised in public consciousness before the campaign begins and before people become entrenched on one side or other of the debate, the better. Now, detailed parliamentary scrutiny is part of that, but of course Parliament is not always perfect. It can be very polarised, and I would argue that if you're going to bring voters in at the decision stage, then it's really important to engage voters as actively as possible earlier on in the process as well, in deliberating about the outcomes. And the best way of doing that is to hold a citizens' assembly. So gather together a randomly selected group of people. The Irish have pioneered this in recent years and have been very successful. We held the UK's first citizens' assembly on Brexit, in 2017, and I'm delighted to see that a number of citizens' assemblies are now taking place. So that's the third principle. Finally, the fourth principle, the referendum campaign should be conducted to minimize misinformation and maximize good information. Maximize the degree to which people can find the information that they want from sources that they trust without being swamped by a whole lot of nonsense. Now, I won't go into detail on that here. This was the subject of the last Constitution Unit seminar, which took place last month, and it was also the subject of a very detailed report that we published earlier this year called Doing Democracy Better. You can find all of this online. But I think it requires a deep rethink of how campaigns are regulated, how broadcasters deal with referendums, how academics approach referendums, and how to deliver their expertise. So we need a fundamental rethink. And then I think I'm out of time, aren't I? So I shall just say very, very quickly, sorry, final thing, many people are talking about another referendum on Brexit, and should there be another referendum Brexit. Because the 2016 referendum violated all four of those principles of good referendum design, we find ourselves in a very difficult situation where we cannot not violate one of two even deeper principles of democracy. If we find where I am. So if we hold another referendum, or we revoke the Article 50 notification without another referendum, then we violate the principle that promises must be kept. If, by contrast, we don't hold another referendum, then we violate the principle that voters must be able to offer informed consent. There is no way of avoiding one of those problems. Which one we go for, I'm very glad I'm not the person who has to decide. And you don't need to waive that. Oh, yes, sorry. I was supposed to waive that at one point as well. Sorry. That's our other report on how to do a further referendum on Brexit. So there are lots of things that we could talk about in terms of how such a referendum would come about, what form it would take, how long it would take. It's all in that report.
Thank you very much, Alan. Meg?
Thank you, Lisa, and thank you, Alan, and thank you, Jeff, for joining us as well. As Lisa has indicated, my primary specialist subject is Parliament, and it's, I think, appropriate that I'm kind of in the middle of this panel, talking about Parliament, which is at the heart of this dispute. It was handed the result by the referendum. That has ended up in court, which Jeff is going to speak about, and it's also appropriate because fundamentally, as the court reminded us, Parliament is at the centre of our constitution. So after the referendum happened, since the referendum has happened, we have had a lot of controversies regarding Parliament, and I'm just going to reflect on some of them. We don't, unlike other countries, in terms of the use of referendums, clearly we don't have a written constitution. And we don't therefore have any rules as to when referendums should be held, on what topics, and what status those referendums have. And we've had a fight since the referendum as to whether it was advisory or binding. It was legally, of course, advisory, and it was for Parliament to deliver the result. We very quickly saw one court case, which I'll refer to as Miller 1, the first case taken by Gina Miller to the Supreme Court, regarding what Parliament's role should be and whether whether Parliament should have any control over whether we triggered Article 50 in order to indicate to the European Union that we intended to leave. The Miller case, that Miller case found in favour of Parliament being involved in the triggering process. which immediately looked like it might be a huge victory for Remainers, because we knew that we had a parliament which was not favourable towards Brexit. And maybe that suggested that Parliament kind of trumped the referendum. But what happened immediately afterwards? The government introduced a bill, and at second reading, that bill approving the triggering Article 50 was approved by 498 votes to 114 votes in the House of Commons. So it seemed that Parliament had accepted that the decision taken in the referendum trumped its own opinion on whether we should go ahead with Brexit or not. So we're in a situation, I think, a very unusual situation in Parliament compared to the way that Parliament usually operates in our constitution. There are three key factors I've suggested. One is that Parliament is unusually living under the cloud, you could say, of a referendum result. It feels unable to express its true opinion because it feels that it needs to deliver on this result, that it's bound by the mandate of the referendum. But there are two other things which are really important as well, which add to the difficulties. A key one is that we, since 2017 at least, are in a period of minority government. This is extremely unusual in British politics and makes parliamentary handling and Parliament's relationship with government much more difficult than it usually is. And just to add to that, as if that wasn't enough, the issue of the referendum, Brexit, is one which fundamentally divides both of the political parties. So you don't even have reliable party blocks operating in Parliament, which you normally largely would do. One of the things I think this teaches us, which is interesting because I teach my students about Parliament, and people often lament the extent to which party leaders control their troops in Parliament. It teaches us that united parliamentary parties are actually quite useful. They kind of help the system to function. Because you have blocks that can form reliable majorities, and at the moment we don't have that. So it's been very, very difficult for Parliament. One of the things that we've seen, and all of this gets terribly jumbled up in terms of where the problem comes from. I think minority government is very, very central to this, and one of the things we've seen is that our parliamentary procedures are not actually well adjusted for minority government. Primarily because, written into parliamentary standing orders, is the suggestion, the principle, that government controls time on the floor of the House of Commons most of the time. So we've seen these instances of parliamentarians trying to, as it has been referred to, seize control of the agenda in order to do things that the government doesn't want to do. And then you have the government up in arms that this is outrageous and unprecedented, and they even suggest unconstitutional. And opinion is very divided on that. Myself, as a Parliament person, I think it's completely appropriate that the majority in the House of Commons ought to be able to decide matters of policy. And if that requires them to control the agenda, I think that's appropriate too. But this has opened up very fundamental divisions in British politics. They're kind of latent divisions which are always there, simmering away in terms of the extent to which the executive should have power and the extent to which Parliament should have power. And government is not dealing with the minority situation either. It opens up these questions of who does have power, but also who should have power. Very often in British politics, I think people around the world looking at British politics and commentators at home as well tend to assume that we have a powerful executive in Britain. We're kind of known for that around the world. But I think we're seeing now how that isn't really true. The reason that the executive tends to look powerful in the British Constitution is because it has a reliable majority in the House of Commons, because we normally have single-party government, and we don't have that at the moment. And aside from that, of course, the majority party is divided. I've studied Parliament for years, and I've argued for a long time that it's a misunderstanding to think that the executive is all-powerful. There's an awful lot of negotiation, usually, that goes on behind the scenes between front benchers and back benchers in the majority party to agree policy. It doesn't happen very publicly on the floor of the House of Commons, but that pressure is there all the time behind the scenes. They need their backbenchers to approve their legislation, and ultimately they need their backbenchers in order to remain in power, to retain their confidence. And ministers who forget that tend to come a cropper. Theresa May arrived as the Prime Minister in a minority government, arrived at a position of minority government in 2017 and continued to behave as if she had a majority, as if she would be able to get her way. She started this rhetoric of Parliament versus people in her kind of state of kind of fury and frustration at not being able to get her way on Brexit. Boris Johnson simply ramped up that rhetoric and actually went as far as shutting Parliament down. That way we land up in the courts, which Jeff will say more about. But in terms of the response to that court case, from my point of view as a scholar of Parliament and as a political scientist, it seemed kind of it's a landmark ruling at one level, but at another level, all it tells us is what we should have known all along, that Parliament is the senior actor in our constitution, and that government gains its legitimacy and power from Parliament. There's this quotation from the court case which I think is really telling, and I know that Jeff is going to put up some other ones. We live in a representative democracy. The House of Commons exists because the people have elected its members. The government is not directly elected by the people, unlike in some other places. The government exists because it has the confidence of the House of Commons. It has no democratic legitimacy other than that. And that is a core principle in our Constitution, which the court has reinforced and reminded us of. So in one sense, I think we're kind of in a happy place because a fundamental principle in our Constitution has been upheld and reinforced, and we've been reminded of it. And I hope that in future we will not fall into the trap of thinking that the executive is powerful and Parliament is weak. But of course, in other ways, we're in a very, very unhappy place. We are a very polarized nation along Brexit lines. And we've even become polarized now on questions such as this, where people are lining up according to their Brexit identities as to whether they're on government side or Parliament side. And this is very, very problematic and unhealthy. We have a situation now where basically the executive, I think, is trying to claim that it does have an alternative legitimacy to Parliament, because it's claiming that it has a legitimacy that comes from the referendum result, a mandate that comes from the referendum, where you then have Parliament, which has a competing mandate. And as Alan has said, there are kind of two fundamental questions here. Do we want to Brexit? On that, there's a mandate from the people, and Parliament voted overwhelmingly in favour of that with the trigger. But how we Brexit, the detail of how we do that, is a question which has been handed to Parliament, and we're locked now in this difficult difficult tension with the government. So we're left with a rift between the government and Parliament. We're left looking at how we don't adapt well to minority government, and I think that's something we're going to have to reflect upon. And we're left with this horrible tension between the principles of direct and representative democracy and these questions of how we use referendums, all of which we're going to have to return to if and when the dust ever settles. Thank you.
Thank you very much indeed, Meg. And Jeff.
Thank you very much. Can you hear me? Yes. Great. Well, I'm a lawyer, not a political scientist, so this talk will unfortunately be more boring, I have to say. But thankfully, my topic is very interesting and indeed spectacular for any public lawyer. So what I'll address in the brief time that I have is essentially to outline what the recent Supreme Court case was, what the judgment's legal significance and constitutional significance was, and then address whether that case and indeed the whole Brexit crisis suggests that we should have a written constitution, because that's something I've also written about. So let me begin with the judgment. So the facts were that the Prime Minister announced on the 28th of September that he would prorogue Parliament from around the 9th of September to the 14th of October. And at 5 weeks, it was the longest prorogation in over 40 years. And it came at a time in which the UK was locked in existential negotiations about whether the country would leave the European Union without a deal. So the length of the prorogation and the time at which it came were both considered extremely unusual and were challenged in the courts. Now, in the earlier proceedings, there were cases in Scotland and in England. And in the Scottish case, it failed to succeed at the first instance. At the second instance, the court found that the Prime Minister was deliberately trying to stymie Parliament, to prevent it from meeting. That was his improper purpose, which is unlawful in public law. The English Divisional Court, which had 3 senior judges on it at first instance, said that this issue is inherently political and it's not something a court can rule on. Now, the person who brought that case in the English courts was Gina Miller. She appealed to the Supreme Court, and Sir John Major, former Prime Minister, joined her case, and both of those cases were heard in the Supreme Court. So what the court found was extremely important. And let me begin by saying that it gave a unanimous judgment on an 11-judge panel. That's the second time it's ever had a judgment with 11 judges on it, and it's the first time it's ever given a unanimous judgment. This technique of giving so-called per curiam decisions is something that other foreign courts have used when the issue is extremely important. The famous Brown v. Board of Education case in the US from 1954 about desegregation was of that nature. The Quebec secession reference in Canada was also of that nature. The Supreme Court of the United Kingdom used that here. So what were the main legal findings? Firstly, that the case was not inherently political, that it had important legal content, that it is a justiciable dispute. Now, Professor Tom Poole of the LSE said even bringing this case broke new legal ground, and he's right. To challenge a decision on prorogation by a sitting prime minister is spectacular and unprecedented in UK public law. And the finding of the divisional court was disagreed with by most scholars, but looking at the orthodox development of English public law, it wasn't that surprising, to be honest. The court found, I think the subtext of its judgment is that it's contrary to the rule of law for any area of executive power to be completely uncontrollable by the courts. That its specific stated grounds for finding it justiciable were slightly different, a little more complicated, but I think that's what was underlying their decision. As for the law, the court found that there were two legal principles that would structure the exercise of the prorogation power. Rather, it would contain the exercise. One is the principle of parliamentary supremacy, or parliamentary sovereignty, and the other is parliamentary accountability. Now, parliamentary sovereignty says that a statute, an act of the UK Parliament, is the highest form of law. Nothing can derogate from it. But they also found in this case, which is very important, that Parliament's ability to pass legislation in the first place is also part of this principle. And that was not at issue in this case, but it's a legal finding that has significance in the future. The second principle they found was the principle of parliamentary accountability. And the parliamentary accountability means that the government must appear, it has a duty to answer parliamentary questions in Parliament, appear before committees, it has to have its delegated legislation scrutinized in Parliament. The court was prepared to find that any interference with parliamentary accountability or parliamentary sovereignty would have to be justified to the court. And it set out a new legal standard, which I'm going to put on a slide in just a moment. So this is the legal standard that now controls the prorogation power. Now, the lawyer reading this will see immediately that the issue will turn, in any case where prorogation is at issue, on whether there is a reasonable justification for it. And they'll know that the ultimate judge of whether there is a reasonable justification will be the courts under this standard. That's a very important development. The subtext of the last sentence, though, is that the interference has to be sufficiently serious. That means don't come to us if it's even remotely a close call to justify this exceptional course. It's a broad legal standard. It's narrowed with this language. But that is now the constitutional law relating to what the courts will do to control prorogation. They found in the result in the case that this standard was broken because there was nothing in the evidence submitted to the court that could justify 5 weeks at this time. There was various pieces of evidence submitted, and one of the most decisive pieces of evidence was a witness statement by Sir John Major saying, normally you don't need more than about 5 days to prepare a Queen's speech. And since the Prime Minister, the sitting Prime Minister Boris Johnson, didn't submit a witness statement, the court said on the evidence before us, there's simply nothing to justify this length of time. The last significant thing was that they quashed the Queen's Order in Council, and they essentially said that when the commissioners came into Parliament to read out to it, the Queen orders that this session be brought to a close, that it's prorogued, They said that those commissioners entered with a blank piece of paper, effectively. And the upshot of that was that Hansard had to be amended, which might seem like something that's a small point of detail to some, but it's a big point in the British Constitution. Now, what is the legal significance and what is the constitutional significance of this judgment? The legal significance is threefold. Firstly, you see a new confidence emerge on the court in applying the existing public law doctrines. And you see this especially at the extraordinary boldness and harshness of the language that's used in the judgment. So when the court asked, is the prorogation seeking to frustrate, or is it having the effect of frustrating parliamentary accountability? They simply said, well, of course it does. Now that's quite extraordinary. This is a sitting prime minister. They also said that in the record, there is no reason, let alone a good reason, to prorogue Parliament for 5 years. That's a direct quote. And lastly, they said, 5 weeks. Important difference. Nowhere is there a hint that the Prime Minister, in giving advice to Her Majesty, is more than simply the leader of a government seeking to promote its own policies, i.e. he was having no regard to the interests of Parliament itself. Now those are extraordinary and unprecedented statements in public law. The second piece of legal significance is this new legal standard of parliamentary accountability and of parliamentary sovereignty. These don't just apply to prorogation. My view is that they probably would support a court stopping ministers that might seek to advise the Queen to refuse royal assent to a bill that's passed both houses of Parliament. That was an open legal issue before this case. My view now is it's not closed, but you certainly get a hearing in the courts for that claim. Thank you. And possibly the non-confidence procedure under the Fixed Term Parliaments Act. I think the court would be more willing to intervene if, for instance, a prime minister were to try to squat in number 10. So that's significant. The second really important thing about the case, above its legal significance for doctrinal constitutional law, is the constitutional significance about the role of the court. And I want to put up another slide now. So here the court's saying, if the issue is legal at all, it's for the courts to decide it. And then it outlines a role for the court to protect the separation of powers. My view is that this statement and the judgment generally, the way it was received in the public, the judgment, the optics of the judgment. This is a court that not more than a decade ago was sitting in a committee room in the House of Lords, but the way that it was presented to the public is an independent constitutional institution, a new veto player. What we're seeing is the emergence, I feel, of a court that is like a constitutional court, similar to what the Federal Constitutional Court in Germany is. At least this is the impression it's making on the legal academy and on the public. And that means a new confidence in adjudicating disputes between different branches of government on the one hand and between state and citizen on the other. Let me conclude then by speaking briefly about the role of a written constitution. Does the Brexit debacle, if you want to call it that, and does this Supreme Court case, if you consider it a positive development, suggest that we need a written constitution? Well, the part of the difficulty at answering such a question is that we don't know what a written constitution would include, right? But I can say with some degree of confidence that I think that there's been an enormous amount of confusion in this crisis about issues that probably would not have existed if we did have a codified constitution. If you look at some of the drafts that have been circulated, potential drafts. One issue is the whole first Gina Miller case. Do you need an act of parliament to notify the European Union of our intention to leave? If we had a written constitution, the role of the United Kingdom, the EU in the constitution would be clear there. It would require constitutional amendment. There'd be no question that there would be a role for Parliament. I think it would be the case on the drafts I've seen that ministers would be unable to advise the monarch to refuse royal assent, which would have prevented a lot of blood, sweat, and tears earlier this year. The rules relating to when the Prime Minister would need to resign in a non-confidence scenario would likely be clear. It would probably be the case that we need a second referendum, as this would entail a constitutional amendment. The legislative procedure for some aspects of this process would be much clearer because you'd need a constitutional amendment. And silly things like the idea of invoking the Civil Contingencies Act to suspend the law, which had a lot of airtime last week, wouldn't have been possible under the drafts I've seen. So those would be clear. I think that it's disputable whether you want a stronger role for the Supreme Court, and I'm going to wrap up in just about 30 seconds. What we've seen in this recent episode is the Supreme Court has showed that the legally enforceable Constitution can produce a result that the political Constitution could not produce. It was claimed by many people that the prorogation was unconstitutional on conventional terms, but nothing happened until the court intervened. So that could be an example. But on the other hand, if you're going to have a court play a larger role, you'll need to deal with the possibility that it would be politicized on the one hand, and that the Constitution would become less flexible on the other, which would possibly have repercussions for the democratic character of the Constitution. So my answer on the question of whether this all suggests we should have a written Constitution is it's a bit complicated. But my answer on whether we should have a written Constitution is unequivocally yes, but for other reasons. I think because in a democratic society, the people should be involved in stating what the fundamental rules of the Constitution are, and that's not the Constitution we presently have. Thank you.
Wonderful, thank you. We're now going to open up the floor to questions from the audience. I think a couple of our volunteers are going to come and grab some microphones that will have some roving mics. As I mentioned, we're going to take questions from 3 people at a time, just because I want to make sure I can get to as many of you as possible. So if there's anyone who'd like to ask a question, please just put your hand up. Okay, so... Sorry. Can I go first of all to the lady over here, and secondly to the gentleman in blue at the front, and is it? Yes, over there. Thank you.
So I was thinking that by having laws and regulations, we're kind of trying to dominate the conversation, to steer it a certain way. What if we focused on ethics and we tried to influence it? Do you think that that's a viable option?
Thank you. And at the front.
I'd like to ask a question in response to the first speaker, whose name I apologise I didn't get, but Alan. You made the point I thought was quite controversial. You thought that the only reason why a second referendum might not be justifiable is it because it contravenes or violates a deeper principle that the promise should be kept. Can you tell me what promise was made in the first referendum that would be kept or in danger of not being kept?
Thank you. And our third question.
You might have answered this already, but I was just wondering, for Alan, you said that we should educate people more, but how are we going to do that? Because many people are already tired of hearing the word Brexit. So how do you think we'll be able to engage 18-year-olds when they have already had enough and they're just going to vote randomly because they aren't bothered to get educated on it first? Yes, schools can educate people on this topic, but not everyone is going to listen, and eventually when they do vote and vote randomly, then this will affect the result. Whereas the first referendum, people found out about this topic more as if it was their first time listening to it and learning about it, so they want to hear more about it. But now no one really cares about it anymore at this moment in time, so how will you make them care and educate them more on the topic so that they can send a valuable vote and not just a lucky guess towards the idea of Brexit?
Lovely, thank you. So we have 3 great questions: the role of ethics and law and regulation, and which of those plays what role. We have the question of what promises are made, and I suppose how do we identify the promise, and then how we can achieve good civic education, particularly in the face of Brexit fatigue. Over to the panel. Who'd like to kick off?
Shall I go first? I love the first question, but I'm going to resist answering it because the second and third were both directed particularly to me. So what promise was made in the first referendum? Well, pretty much everyone campaigning in that referendum said that they would treat the result as being binding. That they would accept that if people voted to leave the EU, then we would leave the EU. And I think that needs to be taken very seriously. What was binding? So yes, that is a good question. The principle, as I said, only the principle was stated that we should leave the EU, and the detail was not filled in. That's why we have a conflict between the two principles that I set out, the principle of abiding by that promise, but also allowing people to make a choice on the basis of solid information about what's actually available. And I think both of those principles are really fundamentally important. And we shouldn't imagine that somehow there's an easy answer to the question of what is the more democratic choice now as to whether we have a referendum or not. I don't think there is an easy answer to that. The third question was great, thank you. And I completely agree with you that things would have been much better had we got this right first time. And the fact that we have gone through this 3.5-year process now of ghastly, purgatorial, endless debate about all this monotonous stuff makes it very difficult to have a good referendum. If we are going to have a good referendum. So it's partly just because so many people are bored. It's partly because so many people are so entrenched on one or other side of the debate that to have a really good quality discussion in another referendum will be very, very bit difficult. But I think there are things we can do. I think broadcasters can do a much better job than they did in 2016 of highlighting good information and calling out campaigners who spout nonsense, which they did on both sides, a great deal. I think academics can do an enhanced job of intervening and giving their expertise to the discussion. And we have the problem that apparently no one trusts experts anymore, but actually that's not what the polling evidence suggests. Actually, people do still put a lot of confidence in expertise. I think it's difficult to change the regulations around referendum campaigning before an early referendum, but we could at least do some of the really obvious things that need to change in terms of making sure that advertisements in social media are visible to all. And the tech companies have started putting political advertising in archives so that we can actually see advertisements that are out there. So we could do some things in order to improve the regulation, but I absolutely agree that it's going to be difficult.
Thank you. I'm not sure how to interpret the ethics question, and I'm inclined to partly leave it to Jeff because he's a bit of a political theorist and he will have his way of weaving ethics into his answer, I think. But I will try and use that word to tie together some of the things that Jeff was saying and some of the things that I was saying. Because I think one way of, if you're introducing ethics, you're beginning to introduce sort of value judgments and philosophies. And I think that if we were sitting down and writing a constitution, some of those things would be very big and to the fore. We would have to confront some very big questions about the way we want our politics to work, the rights and wrongs of how our politics should work, which I think would be... I'm sympathetic to what Jeff is saying about a written constitution, but I think I'd just like to tease out some of the complexities a little bit, because I think, for one thing, in the very polarized environment that we're in at the moment, as I've said, we're in a situation where Brexit identity is stronger, much stronger among the British among the British public than party identity is and has been for years. And so we're tending to look at every question through this Brexit lens, to the point where, as I said, we're judging whether the executive should have power or the legislature should have power and what the role of the courts is through a Brexit lens. And that is a pretty difficult time to sit down and try and get an agreement. So in fact, you go back to types of things that Alan was talking about the need for citizens' assemblies and forums in which we can discuss things which bring people together rather than, as referendums do, drive them apart. But we're in at such a divided time, agreement on some of those principles, I think, would be very politicized and very difficult. There's another thing, I think, which is interesting. I'd be interested to hear Jeff's response to regarding the pros and cons of a written constitution. What the judges did, I think, was very clever in that it's kind of a slight contradiction, but the judges stepped in and reinstated the core principle of the political constitution that we have, because we don't famously have a legal constitution. It's not adjudicated by judges, it's decided by politicians. They were able to do that precisely because Parliament had been shut down. The government was arguing that these were political questions, nothing to do with judges, it ought to be sorted out politically, and the judges in questioning the government lawyers were saying, but how can it be sorted out politically? Politics happens in Parliament, you've just shut Parliament down, that's the point. So the judges reinstated the political constitution. I don't think they did overstep the mark. I don't think we are seeing kind of judicial activism. You can't say that about this case. But if you had a written constitution, the judges would adjudicate it. So I think there is a fundamental question about who we think should be the last arbiter of our constitution. Should it be Parliament or should it be the courts? That is kind of, not sure it's ethical, it's certainly sort of philosophical question. And in Britain, we have always answered that it should be Parliament. And if we move to a written constitution, the answer would be the courts. And I genuinely don't know what the right answer to that question is, but it's a big question.